Today we're looking at the various tax acts and events that really directly led to the Revolutionary War. So a lot of it's going to be the tax acts, and I don't always like doing just these kind of lists where, this, and this happened, and just it feels like, it's a list rather than looking at the larger picture. But these are super important, and it's like a domino effect building on from the different things that continue to happen that push the colonists over to supporting for the war. So what we're going to look at, and again, remember with what happens ultimately with the 7 Years' War and the wars that had happened before, is that it created this significant debt for the British. And then they looked in part to the colonies to help pay for it, which the argument was of, hey, we fought for you, we spent our money to help you in the colonies too. You guys should be responsible for some of that back. The other problem that had happened, so after the, let's just do after the war, right? We mentioned that you had extreme debt. And B, believed most not British colonists, the British believed colonists should pay some of the costs, because again the idea was we fought in the colonies to protect you, so fair is fair. Now for the colonist view, so this is the British view, the colonists only had to fight here because of your interest in Europe. And I mentioned in the last lecture too, right, this flip forth, the view that went back and forth about how their relationship, and this idea that it was, we're the same, we're all English British citizens, and then back to where the British were superior, you're colonists, you aren't British citizens, to Andros the extreme, you don't even have any rights except for not to be sold as a slave. And then it went back during the war as allies and equal. So we flip-flopped again during the war. We're allies. After the war, by the mid 1760s here, mid 1760s. So it wasn't, right after the war, but after the war, around the mid 1760s, it was now colonists are not only inferior, but subordinates to British. Again, this separation of that. So what we get, look at taxation, is that one of the things they decide, because of really all of these, is we can tax. And there was this belief that Parliament represented all of Britons everywhere, and what they called, because there was a requirement, which becomes the phrase, right? Taxation with representation. That you had to have representation. So what they argued though, is the virtual representation, the British. And what the argument with the virtual representation was that each member represented the entire empire in Parliament, not just your own district. And so everyone who lived under the British Crown's interests were taken into account. Members of Parliament represent both their district and all of the British Crown. So you therefore have, you're being represented. Of course, the colonists are not going to see this way. Colonists do not agree. And I mean, it makes sense because the reality is if you didn't live in the colonies, didn't live in colonies and understand them, you don't always pick the best taxes, which we'll see. What to tax and how much is not understood. And so, which is what we get into problems with this way. One of the things they ultimately decide is, the British, is that they get more direct with taxing. So the idea was, we should be able to tax, especially if we're lowering taxes or doing other things like that. So what we see here, the best thing we see with taxation and several of these acts is the British severely misunderstanding how the colonists would react to these types of things, because they honestly weren't being like, yeah, we're being hard asses and we're gonna tax them so much and screw them and they're gonna hate it. It was like, no, we're gonna, like, for example, the Sugar Act, we're gonna put this tax out and it's gonna lower prices, so who's gonna be mad about that, right? And that's not exactly how it worked for various things. And it's gonna be the same thing later with the Townshend Acts. I mean, the Stamp Act not so much, but the Sugar Act and the Townshend Act and the Tea Act, they honestly didn't think that these would be huge issues. And it just shows you how much they misread the whole situation, as well as, I think, puts a point for the colonist about needing representation. Because if you don't have that representation, that person could have told them, hey, no, don't do this. You don't want to do that. They're going to get so pissed. Tax over here. They aren't going to care. Or put it forth to let them choose between these two items and then they'll be happy. But instead, you had people that weren't living there not understanding the mentality that was going on, the conflict that the colonists and the British were back to tensions between how they viewed each other and all of that. So the Sugar Act. The Sugar Act was 1764, and it was based on a molasses tax that already existed. Let's see. Based on which molasses, and then the sugar molasses tax. And the aspect of the Sugar Act was that they wanted to really, they wanted to stop the smuggling and have where the merchants. So you had these different components of like getting something from Britain, from like the British, and it went to let's see, we'll look at how it was. Try to show this. So with importing, the idea is that the British, right, shipped it, and then they gave it to often a middleman, and then they gave it to the merchants who sold it to the colonists, right? So the merchants sold to colonists. The idea with the smuggling colonial merchants is that they would bypass this part and get it smuggled, so when the British dropped it off, but instead, so here they drop it off, but instead of giving it to the middleman that would then sell it to the merchant, it'd get it bypass the merchants who could then sell it to the colonists and not pay some of the taxes and thus make it a little bit cheaper. So that was that was what the English saw as a problem, and that just trying to make it cheaper. The new taxes were meant to be, the taxes wasn't so much that it was new taxes, because it was cheaper. It was that they reduced the actual tax. But what they did, and this is where I was doing that crappy drawing for you guys, was that they made the rules harder for smuggling. So made it more difficult to smuggle, and they made the punishment for violating this, for smuggling, violating taxes, harsher and more likely to get in trouble. And specifically how they did that was, is that they strengthened what was called the Admiralty Courts. And the Admiralty Courts, what they specifically did with this is, if you were accused of smuggling now, it gave them more power. If you're accused of smuggling, then you would be judged without a jury trial. Without jury trial. So that's the key of the Sugar Act. So sorry, that was a little convoluted because I was getting messed up with the drawing. But the Sugar Act, based on a pre-existing tax, and for the British, it was like, well, we're lowering the tax, because that was the actual tax was reduced. It was lowered. You paid less, but not really, because what they did is they made it harder to smuggle, right? So that's the key with this, is we're gonna make the tax less, but we're gonna make sure it actually gets paid now. And on top of that, if you do get caught smuggling, then it's going to be significantly more higher punishment for those who do. So this largely affected the merchants, and they felt that it threatened profits. I mean, part of it, somewhat, you're like being indignant of, how dare they don't let us break the rules anymore, kind of thing. But you had is just this various rules. There was another one, the Revenue Act, that made it that so certain goods that had been usually up to this point freely traded now had to be shipped through England, which meant that it would also cost more for the merchant. So it was these two things, but especially the Sugar Act. This one doesn't get as much protest by the people, because it impacted less individuals. I mean, the merchants that really would have felt this more than everyone else. And the fact that it had to do somewhat with the fact that they had been smuggling and sneaking around the whole tax in the first place. But it still was one of those first things that people did refer to and say, see, they're not being fair in what they're doing here. I think more than anything, it wasn't that it was the fact that the Admiralty Courts and the fact what happened if you got caught, that was harsher. I'm putting here, I did mention, like I said, the other thing that was also that made the Sugar Act even worse in the merchants' eyes was the Revenue Act that also took place, which same thing, is all about creating a middleman. And this would have been England at this point that trade had to go through, which makes prices higher. Okay, so not a ton as far as if you're looking at what was the reaction, how did things go. There wasn't a ton, but it's going to be in the next one. It is going to be significantly more, and that's the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was the next one, and was part of strengthening. See, both of these, this was it too. It was trying to help people stop evading. It was meant to stop people from evading the Navigation Acts that had been in place. All right. And this was, so same thing. They didn't lower taxes though. This one was different because it impacts more people, and it wasn't lowered. So the Sugar Act, they lowered the tax. Stamp Act, they don't. And it's the first time that Parliament decides to directly tax the colonies rather than through regulation and trade. So it decides to directly tax colonies rather than through trade and regulation. Right? This is going to be a tax that they add, and it's directly is important, right? Because it wasn't like they didn't have other taxes, but the colonists in the past have been largely able to help decide these, and this one was not. They were not given any say. They weren't asked, "What would you like to do?" It was, "Here is the new tax, and this is what you're going to pay." And that was part of the resentment, was, of course, that the colonists were told this is what they had to do. It also pissed them off what it was. So the Stamp Act essentially was a tax on all printed materials. All right, so in any printed materials in the produced in the colonies. Okay, so that, I mean, and everything, if you think about it, newspapers, stationery, envelopes, books, court documents, marriage certificates, land ownership documents. Cards, like playing cards. Playing cards. Some dice, even, that were seen as partly printed. I'll just put that with this dice. Court documents, marriage certificates, land ownership, newspapers, stationaries, books, anything that you could think of that was printed was now taxed. Now, in some stuff, like newspapers, like say posters, books, playing cards, etc., like that, it's not as big of a deal, because you could totally, if it was these ones here, right, you could, stationery, books, posters, playing cards. These ones, there's no consequence to purchasing a non-taxed item, right? I mean, there wasn't a huge thing for catching, because so what if, you're not, if you have a book that doesn't have the tax, they're not coming into your house and looking for that. But, right, any official item, such as the court documents, marriage certificates, etc., had to have the stamp, or it was illegal and void. So that's kind of important when it's land or marriage certificate or court documents or other kind of economic, commercial, commercial documents. Right, okay, so any of these things, you can't bypass it, because there was an underground market for some of that newspaper stuff once it came out. This impacted tons of people. Okay, so the Sugar Act impacted mostly merchants, and that's a key with this. Let's see, right, here's the difference. Sugar Act largely impacted, let's put it this way, merchants, colonial merchants. Whereas the Stamp Act impacted everyone. So it was a significantly larger. The other thing is, I was going to say, not just everyone, it directly impacted the profits of printers. Don't ever piss off the printers at this page, because this is, pre-internet, this is how they got information across. So, of course, the printers are gonna be printing underground pamphlets against printing anti-Stamp Act information. Like, one of the problems that the Stamp Act had, or Sugar Act, sorry, the Sugar Act had of not, gaining widespread protest and outrage, is that a lot of people weren't really aware of it. If you weren't within that business, if you didn't work as a colonial merchant, or they didn't share that with you, the average person probably didn't at first really know what was going on with the Sugar Act. But with the Stamp Act, everyone did, and if they didn't, the printers made sure they did. They printed tons of pamphlets that was all anti-Stamp Act. So it was, you picked the wrong group of people to kind of piss off, because they had the best chance of disseminating the information and getting people to hear about it. So it, didn't go so well. It offended pretty much everyone. People resented that they were forced to pay for a tax for any rented material, and the fact that the printers could actively put this anti-Stamp Act sentiment forward, along with members of this of the community that were printed newspapers, read books, published papers. These are all the people that were actively involved in political affairs. So not only was it printers, but people actively involved in political affairs. Right, so you got the two dangerous groups to piss off if you're wanting to have them I guess be activists, right? This is the idea, is that this is you just selected the ones most likely to be activists at this point to promote that. So the Stamp Acts actually got a lot of not only anger and discussion, but actual protest with the community, which they end up doing 5 here, right? The Virginia resolutions on the Stamp Act. So what you had from this activist was an official response and protest to the Stamp Act. This is in Voices of Freedom, page 86. Okay, so one of the things that's key with this one, you have all these laws. So if you go through in the book, one of the best ways to do it is they do it. They resolved. All right, each one of those is a specific item, and they didn't end up approving all of them. And it mentions it in your question. Why did they adopt the first 4 and reject the final 3? So 5, 6, and 7, if you number them. They're not actually numbered. I just numbered them to make it easier to be clear which ones were actual things. So the first three, because I want to look at these, because this is important as far as what they're putting forth. So you have one that says that they are all subjects. Here, let's resolutions. First one was that it says we're settlers of His Majesty's colony, and with that we brought with them and transmitted to them their posterity and all of His other Majesty's subjects since inhabiting it in His Majesty's colony, all the privileges and immunities that have been held, enjoyed, and possessed by the great people of Britain. So it's somewhat convoluted, but the key with this one is mostly, we are British citizens. and still have the rights of British citizens. Okay, so there's that. Hang on just a second. Okay, back to it. I'll be very quick, obviously, for you guys. Sorry. Have to pause sometimes when I can hear the kids getting a little rowdy before you start hearing them yell over the lecture. Okay, so we are British citizens and still have the rights of British citizens. The second resolution is really kind of reaffirming the first a little bit more, that they have all the rights of natural born subjects. And that's just reinforcing this. And they felt like they had to do this because it kept going, back and forth as far as what rights did they have, what rights did they not. The third was that taxation by the people, which is this taxation of actual representation, that virtual, what this is saying is no virtual representation. Right, they say it has to actually be by the people. And then that the fourth one was that they had enjoyed the right of being governed by their own assembly and the articles of taxes and internal police, and we never forfeited that. So you have basically this semi-autonomous government, and taxation has always been what it is, always been this way, and have not forfeited, they never gave that up and have not given that up. That right up. Now, those are the ones that were passed. And it mentions the other one, 5. And there's a reason why with the 5, that was that it's a little bit more I guess forceful. They say it's illegal for anyone but the General Assembly to have the right to do this. So illegal for anyone but colonial government to make decisions, we'll say. Make law, not full laws. Make local decisions. 6 says basically that then if this happens, because it's illegal, not bound to those laws. And which I hopefully you can see why they didn't select these ones. These are quite a bit more forceful. And then the last one says that anyone who shall, by speaking or writing, assert or maintain that any person or persons other than General Assembly of this colony have any right or power to impose or lay a taxation on the people shall be deemed enemy to the Majesty's colony. So this one is saying that anyone who suggests otherwise will be deemed an enemy, which is a harsh word, of the colonies. Okay, so oops, didn't do quite like that. Here we go. These were passed. These not passed, and hopefully it makes sense why. I mean, I'm going to mention it anyway, but hopefully it's a little bit clear to you. These first ones are much more basic statements of, hey, this is what is going on as far as we're still citizens, and natural born citizens. This one is important. Natural born, because some of the arguments were, sure, you're citizens, but you're like inferior citizens. And here they say, no, we're natural born citizens. We have a right to this as well. And then, the taxation by the people, representation. We never gave up our right to be semi-autonomous, so all of these things should be part of that. The last three then get a little bit harsher with saying that, it's illegal, and if it happens, then we don't have to follow the rules, and anyone who's an enemy. And that's like going towards, we're ready to revolt and not follow any laws. They weren't ready for that yet. So it wasn't like with these early taxations and things like that people immediately jump to, revolt and independence, declare independence. No, people weren't even fully thinking that. And you could see, obviously, a few people were when they created this, but at the same time, what they actually resolved and, improved, they backed off on these ones, saying, no, that's too much. That it takes, it's going to take several aspects to get them ready to declare independence, if you will. So that was what happened with the Stamp Act. But you have, I think it's important with this, is because it impacted so many people, that you have the protest. This was the formal, the Virginia resolution was the formal response. But you had other protests, and you had people definitely actively speaking out against the whole situation. But it wasn't just debate, it wasn't just law. People actually showed up in the streets and kind of had little rallies shouting again, liberty and anti-British sentiment to a degree. The Sons of Liberty. So here we had put 6 here. Other protest and demonstrations. So, it was super active. You had the official, the Stamp Act resolution. We'll put this as the official response, protest response. But then you had all of the more, certainly loud and potentially could be violent protests and demonstrations. The Sons of Liberty were a group that they were newly organized at this point. They did have some individuals that were known, but they weren't like the super elite. But what they were definitely the more liberal group. They were more more liberal and for revolution earlier on. They certainly caused problems and instigated stuff. All right, so one of the areas where you definitely see this is with Paul Revere's engraving. We'll look at with the Boston Massacre, that he was a Son of Liberty and things like that. Anyway, they organized a lot of protests. The Sons of Liberty, they posted signs that said liberty, property and no stamps. They were the ones that got people to march around, and certainly, and not surprisingly, it was their activities that were looked on and alarmed by some of the elite, as well as the British. So they ended up, like I said, encouraging mobs, which did lead to fights and violence. Not insane amounts, but still there, and they were viewed as radical and with alarm by some elite. In Boston, this is where it was largely taking place, why Boston? You have merchants from there, the port, you have a lot of the printers and political activity going on in that area at this time. So elite in Boston and the British, and they're going to continue to play their role. So what's the role of the Sons of Liberty? It's to keep pushing for revolution and getting people to support it. So surprised again, remember we talked about the British didn't think that these would be huge problems. Let's see, we'll put it under wow, my whole numbering system is off on this one. Good job, me. Okay. We'll put it under here 6, 7. What happens? The British response. So they're surprised because they didn't think that the colonies would act this way, and certainly not as strongly as they did. And so you have merchants and manufacturers in England that felt like they were going to lose clients and money if the colonies continued, ended up pushing Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. And it was repealed in 1766, just a year later. So 1766 Stamp Act was repealed. But, right, they don't just repeal it. they it's kind of like the British, like, we have to get in the last word. So what ends up being created is the Declaratory Act. And the Declaratory Act was essentially, look, we may have repealed it, but that's because we wanted to. And ultimately, we still have the right to make whatever tax thing we want. We're not, basic, because I understand some of it. They didn't want to make it seem like because they repealed this that they were agreeing to all the resolutions, like from the Virginia Stamp Act, what they had sent. They didn't want it to look like they were acquiescing to everything, and so the idea with this said basically that your claim of that your representatives get to make these decisions, and only you guys get to levy taxes is not true. We have a right to do that whenever we want, and we have the power to pass these laws. So it was meant to try to reinforce. It didn't. I mean, honestly, this is going to be the problem, is once they start repealing, once they acquiesce to the protest and repeal, the colonists learn, hey, if we push hard enough, they'll back off. And we'll see this again after the Townshend Acts as well. So, Declaratory Act, basically, just, we're repealing it. We are repealing it because we wanted to. Again, this is the informal way of saying it. Not because you, the colonists, have a right to, or not have a right, are the only ones to levy taxes. And more importantly than the argument was, is that they reserve the right, reserve the right to impose taxes whenever they want. It was meant to show, like, even though they'd lost in that sense, it was meant to be like, haha, see, we still have a right. We still are in control, even though they're really not in many cases. So this gets repealed. Woohoo, they won. In that sense, as they saw it, it certainly is going to create, I think, more willingness to push for changes. The next big one are going to be the Townshend Acts. All right, and these are done in the next year, 1767, and it was meant to be, like I said, a new set of taxes that, and they did listen. I guess they did try to pay attention. So the idea was that when people had protested the Stamp Acts, there was some seeming suggestion that it was because it was direct taxation. Like, yeah, we understand regulation and trade. Okay, cool, that's your thing, but don't directly tax us. So we'll put this on here. With Stamp Act protest, it appeared, and it did. It wasn't just a delusional thing the British came up with. It appeared the colonists were saying that direct tax will go equals no, but trade and regulation taxes, right? Those were okay. And so the Townshend Acts take that at their word, essentially, go, okay, so we're not going to direct tax anymore. So, I mean, at least you got to give the British, like, credit for the fact that they didn't, like, then immediately go, yeah, we have the right to do that. And then the next year go, see, we're going to do it. We're going to directly tax you again. They were trying to raise money in a way that was acceptable to the colonists. The problem was, again, this is why taxation with representation actually was a valid and reasonable point. Didn't understand the mood that was going on in the colonies, and the fact that pretty much the British were screwed at this point anyway, that any tax they put forth, no matter what, even if they lowered it and said, you know, new regulation, no taxes whatsoever for this item, but we're going to make sure this happens. It wouldn't have been okay. So, you know, I mean, logically everyone's like, but we're saving so much money. Doesn't matter. They don't have a right to regulate us this way. And certainly not, the direct tax would have been worse. So they were right there. But what they didn't understand still was that even these taxes on trade and regulations at this point, because of the tensions that emerged, then there were some other arguments and in between the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts that occurred, smaller things, but still, like I said, continued tensions. You had the Sons of Liberty continuing to push down on people to suggest that the British, didn't have the rights and authorities for this. And so, of course, when this gets pushed in, people aren't happy. Now, what it was, okay, we're going to impose new taxes on goods that were imported into the colonies. And then again, the bigger part being that they're going to create a board of customs to collect the taxes and stop smuggling. So, new taxes on imported goods. And this was, glass, not that it matters, but glass, paint, oil, lead, paper, tea. These were some of them, some of the goods. Were applied, and the whole goal was to, like I said, raise, actually, here's this is the funny part with this. This money from these was meant to help pay the colonial administrative positions. Right, so judges, governors, other types of government positions. So it was actually meant to help the colonial positions. Now, granted, some of those were done by like what was seen as British and not colonists. Nonetheless, it wasn't going back to England. I think that's the key with this, is that it was not all going back to England. It was staying locally, which they thought would also be helpful. So besides the new taxes, as I mentioned, they created a new new Board of Customs. And the Board of Customs was to do two things: collect taxes and prevent smuggling. Always the smuggling. They don't like the smuggling. We saw the smuggling thing didn't go so well with the Sugar Act. I'm not sure why they thought this part would do so as well. Now this one, of course, who is this one target most? Merchants. And not surprisingly, because they were the ones that were most impacted with. This took longer for people to really be like, no, we're not okay with this. But once it got started, okay, so yeah, merchants first, impacted merchants first, but ultimately it has a large response. And the way that it has a large response is this moves to boycotting. And this, you have a huge reaction with this. The boycotting was largely, for its success, was largely due to the women that women became significantly involved in this. The women decided that what they should do is, because of the taxes part of it, even though there was a few other things with the Townshend Acts, as far as some quartering, which was the idea that colonial people had to provide for soldiers, and things like that people didn't like, and it was, some of this was like suspend and change, but so there was some other smaller stuff, but these were the big things. With the boycotting, women became significantly involved, and what they did is that they basically said, we're going to boycott all English goods, all British goods. And instead, we're going to do what was called homespun goods. Right? They're going to make their own stuff. Make your own stuff locally. So this meant, for some, it was big. No tea. No going to the merchant store and buying stuff directly. The women were going to do this. And this is why the women were necessary for this protest. Because make your own stuff. The men weren't doing this. This was the women. The women had to, if they weren't willing to make their own stuff, it would have collapsed. And women got super, this is where we really see a large increase in women in politics and political, let's say, protest and discussion. What they did is they did a whole bunch of things to encourage it. They had what were called spinning bees. And the spinning bees, women got out their old what is it? The machine that you spin from the wool and other types of things into thread with. Their spinning machine. I'm just gonna call this the spindle. No, the spinning machine. and because the reality is, most women did not make their own goods anymore. Right? We looked at this with early colonial society, the Midwife's Tale. It shows her spinning and her daughters and weaving. Okay, while that still is going to happen as people move further west, and it replicates that again on the East Coast, people weren't doing this anymore. They didn't have to. You bought goods, just like we do, right? Most people don't homespun their own goods. So they had to go find them and get them. They ended up having spinning bees where they, put all of their equipment outside, and they gathered together to learn how to spin. And while they were because the reality was there'd be a couple older women and maybe a couple that knew, and everyone else had no idea how to do this. So they had to actually teach them. But then when they were learning how to spin, they would discuss the politics and issues. This actually was very fascinating. They invited preachers and political speakers to come talk to them. Political speakers. And so it actually, the importance of this is it kept women involved and informed about the political sphere at the time. And they also published. And it wasn't just spinning, right? Homespun goods also included, they had to make their own food. And I'm not talking about obviously cooking, but like you're back to, what was that? Candles, soap is not, I get these two are not food. Food and goods. Right, butter, bread, etc. Right? You're having to make, it's like going back in time. They had to go back in time and go back to like the early colonial period of how do you live when you don't have merchants selling you stuff. Because it was just what it was. You bought stuff at the store. Of course I'm going to go to the store and just get flour. I'm not going to grind my own flour or do this or do that. It's right there. This was like going back to that because a lot of this stuff was imported. And then what they also did was made their own foods or encourage merchants to purchase local goods to sell. All right, and then besides encouraging local merchants to, well, that's actually two parts. Not only did they encourage local merchants to sell, purchase and sell local goods, they also blocked access to merchants who tried to bypass, let's call it, the boycott. If they heard of someone that was trying to actively sell these goods openly, they would actually go stand in front of the store and block it. There was also stories of women physically stopping men that were going in to buy goods that were not homespun, that were going to buy. And then lastly, they also posted newspaper articles on the subject, and they had competitions to encourage it to continue over who produced the most homespun goods. And all of these things were incredibly important for the success, because the reality is a boycott never would have happened if the women hadn't been involved to make these things stick. because how are they going to? I mean, that's just part of it, as far as you weren't going to be successful if women weren't actively involved in this process. And they were successful, because it did, I mean, it opened up people's eyes to the seriousness of this, how involved the colonies were. It got it certainly spread awareness of what was going on. Women actively are then getting involved in talking about it. The Sons of Liberty certainly jumped in there. This actually creates, this boycott creates the Daughters of Liberty. I'll put that back over here. Now, the Daughters of Liberty are not as radical as the Sons of Liberty were, but they certainly now are saying that we have a stake and involvement within this boycott as well. So ultimately, this is successful in pushing for a repeal of, again, not quite everything, but they get a repeal of most of it. So and certainly people are so happy to stop the boycott when they get to, let's see, we'll get to D here, and then, so how it gets repealed and done is that you had British merchants did feel the sting of this, and they were concerned about, like I said, how this impacted trade and well as profits. And so they put pressure because of this on Parliament again to repeal the Townshend Acts. Okay, and so so the British ended up agreeing to do so. So they did repeal the Townshend Acts, except for leaving but left. We'll see. This comes up again later. A tax on tea. Tax on the tea. And they removed the troops from Boston, which I mentioned. Remember the Quartering Act? The placement of that. So they removed troops from Boston as well. And these were the two big things. So again, all the things were repealed except for the tax on tea, which we're going to see that come back up, of course. And then they removed the troops from Britain, which this was connected to the Quartering Act. And I said, skipped over for time, but the Quartering Act had said that merchants and others had to help, assemblies had to help the basic necessities of British soldiers. I can't speak. Sorry. Soldiers. Got it. And this wasn't super well liked either. And what they had to do with that. So that part gets repealed as well. This is seen as a big win. Again, problematic though, because once again, implemented taxes, protest, repeal of taxes. And that is going to create problems. And we're going to see this is going to, where it's going to come into head is we're going to have the Boston Massacre, which is going to, and the repeal actually happens after the Boston Massacre, but we're going to look at that in just in the next section here. So I'm going to bring up the Quartering Act again in a minute. We're going to talk about that. And then we're going to look at how the Boston Massacre, Boston Tea Party with the tea, and then the Continental Congress and all of that.